Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 29. Today we are going over two historical topics, 4.7 and 4.8, beginning with the expansion of democracy and Jackson and federal power. The theme for both of these topics is going to be politics and power. So let's begin with the first topic and the first learning objective. That's explain the causes and effects of the expansion of participatory democracy from 1800 to 1848. So the key concept here says the nation's transition to a more participatory democracy was achieved by expanding suffrage from a system based on property ownership to one based on voting by all adult men, and it was accompanied by the growth of political parties. So this has to do with the growing egalitarian culture that everyone is seen as an equal, despite which how much money one has, or how much property one has, or how much money or property one doesn't have. And again, this is really only applicable to the white male population. Of course, women are still not given equal and full rights, and there's still slavery going on in the country. But for the white male role in government, that is seen as more egalitarian. There is an equality of opportunity. And we have new state constitutions that are starting to take away those property requirements for voting. The older states are starting to amend their state constitutions to remove those requirements as the new northwestern states are being admitted. To show you how much this changed over time, there were voters in the presidential election in 1824. There were 350,000 votes. To 1824, where there, or to 1840, where there are 2.4 million votes. And this new culture of egalitarianism and participation in government is seen in these three paintings here that are done by George Caleb Bingham. They are often used to portray how democracy was growing in the age of the common man. And based on the people gathered around in these paintings, as you can see, you have people that are dressed in very fine clothes sitting right next to people who are dressed in a lot more common clothes. And they are all sitting around, gathering, taking part in this participatory democracy. The one on the bottom right is called the stump speech, and so they're all looking and hearing a politician speak, asking for their vote. And then the two paintings up top are really more dealing with voting. The one on the left is called the county election, in which people are casting their ballots, and then the one on the right is the announcement of the results. And so in all three of these paintings, you see that democracy is a large event that that a lot of people participate in, regardless of income. But the people that you do see that are left out here is women and enslaved people or people of color. All right, continuing on with this expansion of suffrage, new political parties begin to emerge. So the Federalists, they begin to die out after the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812. In this convention, they were said to have considered leaving the United States if the United States did not end its war with Britain, and so they were seen as treasonous, especially since it was towards the end of the war and right before the victory at New Orleans that was done by Andrew Jackson. So the two political parties that are going to arise are going to be the Democrats and the Whigs. So none of these parties were around in the early 1800s. They come about after the election of 1824. So in the election of 1824, Andrew Jackson was running for president against a whole field of candidates, mainly John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. No one wins a majority of the electoral votes, and John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay are set to make a deal that since the House of Representatives was going to decide who the winner is, John Quincy Adams would offer Henry Clay, then the Speaker of the House, the position of Secretary of State if he could swing the House to the side of John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson calls this the corrupt bargain. He will campaign for the next 4 years and then become president himself in 1828, solidifying the new Democratic Party. Jackson, during his presidency, is going to be accused by former Democratic Republicans of using too much federal power. And so they developed the Whig Party. Now, the Whig Party was original to England, and they were in opposition of monarchical power, of too much monarchical power. And so for that reason, they would call Andrew Jackson a king, or you see here that they portrayed him as a king in a political cartoon as King Andrew I. In this new age of democracy, you saw that there was more participation from the common person. It was much more open, and so you see more campaigning. And when there's more campaigning, you also see more mudslinging too. Mudslinging is negative campaigning. During the 1824 and 1828 campaign, Andrew Jackson's wife was being accused of being unfaithful to him, and very shortly after he won the presidency, she died, and he blamed this on the mudslinging of the campaign. So he was always very bitter for the negative campaigning that he received. Party loyalty is going to remain strong, and this is going to be fostered through the spoils system. So once the president wins office, he is going to reward all of his loyal party supporters with positions in government. That's what the spoils system is. And then when the next president is elected, they have the prerogative to appoint their supporters to those same government offices. All right, moving on to the next learning objective. Explain the causes and effects of continuing policy debates about the role of the federal government from 1800 to 1848. So, we'll begin with the new political parties. By the 1820s and 1830s, new political parties arose, the Democrats, led by Andrew Jackson, and the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, that disagreed about the role and powers of the federal government and issues such as the national bank, tariffs, and federally funded and internal improvements. So, we've talked about how the Democrats and the Whigs came about. This happened after the election of 1824. Notable Whigs that you need to know are Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and you can think of them as a nationalist faction of the Democratic Republican Party. So Henry Clay had his American system that we've already talked about, with a national bank, protective tariffs, and national improvements or internal improvements on infrastructure. That's going to be very similar to the total Whig platform. Now, for the powers of the federal government, Jackson wanted a smaller government, so therefore he vetoed a lot of bills, more than any of the other presidents combined. And he also left abolition to the states. He said that this is not going to be something that the federal government should have power over, though he did intervene anytime that abolitionists were trying to send abolitionist literature to southern states in the U.S. mail. So there was a little bit of hypocrisy on his stance with slavery, because he himself was an enslaver and dealt in enslaved labor during his presidency. All right, so one of the big issues between Jackson, the Democrats, and Clay and the Whigs was the Second Bank of the United States. Remember, this is central to the American system that Clay had developed. But Jackson had always opposed the bank. From the very first time that he had given a message to Congress, he railed against it as the Hydra of corruption, so this many-headed monster of corruption. And he continues to talk about it every year, but the Whig Party believe that he is faking it, that he's just trying to seem like he's against it, but he understands that it is important, so therefore, if worst came to worst, that he would not do anything against the bank. So they tried to make it an issue in the 1832 election. Henry Clay puts the rechartering of the bank up for a vote in 1832. It passes Congress very easily with the help of Henry Clay, and it gets to Andrew Jackson's desk to sign. And after 4 years of making threats against the bank, Andrew Jackson vetoes the bank, so therefore it is not going to be rechartered, and the current charter will expire in 1834. Now, Jackson wins re-election, so this backfires twice as hard for the Whigs, because not only do they not get the charter renewed, but they also fail to defeat Jackson in the election. And so to continue killing the bank, Jackson is going to take out all of the federal deposits from the National Bank, and he's going to deposit them in several different state banks around the country. These are called the pet banks. So the bank war and another policy of Jackson's called Specie Circular is going to cause a financial panic in 1837. Now, Specie Circular is a policy that was going to require the purchase of federal land in the West only to be done with hard currency. That's coins, gold, or silver, and they were not going to accept banknotes or paper money because there was a huge amount of speculation on Western land, and in order to curb that speculation, the government was trying to make it harder to purchase, to try and keep that speculation to a minimum. So these two policies proved to be disastrous for the economy, and whenever the financial panic begins, Andrew Jackson's not going to be in office to feel the political repercussions. It's going to be his vice president, Martin Van Buren, who will become president and then be voted out of office because of the economy. All right, so tariffs is the next big issue. So remember, the Whigs liked tariffs, also part of the American system. And in 1828, they passed the highest tariff to date. As you can see from the chart there, it's still the highest tariff that we've ever had in U.S. history. It was over 60%. And it was dubbed by the South as the tariff of abominations. It was challenged by the state of South Carolina during the nullification crisis. In the nullification crisis, South Carolina politicians like the Vice President of the United States during Jackson's first term, John C. Calhoun, said that if a state ever believes that a federal law is unconstitutional, they have the right to nullify it. Now, where would they get this idea? Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the previous century had penned the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, explaining this as compact theory, that the states had come together in a compact, and that if they ever felt that this compact that they had made, this pact that they made with each other, was not beneficial to one of them, that they could leave or that they could nullify one of the laws that had been passed. Jackson calls this treasonous, he readies the troops, but eventually it's going to get solved by Henry Clay in Congress with a new compromise tariff that South Carolina agrees to pay. And then the final issue here, internal improvements. Again, another part of the Whigs' American system. Jackson would not fund projects located in only one state. An example of this was the Maysville Road, which was going to only be located within the state of Kentucky. And it just turns out that Henry Clay was from the state of Kentucky. The Whigs favored spending federal money on these internal improvements, saying that the transportation that they provided, the infrastructure that they provided, would help the country grow at a faster rate, and it would help the economy be stronger and more self-sufficient. All right, let's talk about expansion and American Indians. So the frontier settlers tended to champion expansion efforts, while American Indian resistance led to a sequence of wars and federal efforts to control and relocate American Indian populations. So we're looking at the southeast of the United States here, and white settlers are starting to move and expand from east to west. They're looking for new land as they have exhausted the soil in the southeast and moving further west towards the Mississippi. As they're moving west, of course, they are running into Native Americans who have been there for generations, and they begin to resist this encroachment. So we've already talked about Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, who is also called the Prophet, and their attempt to create a confederacy that happens to end in the middle of the War of 1812 during their death. The state of Georgia is trying to push out the Cherokee tribes by legislating laws that are going to take away some of their rights, forcing them to leave. The Cherokees get a victory in the Supreme Court with the court case Worcester versus Georgia, which ultimately said that states cannot make a law that affects Native Americans because they are semi-sovereign. And only the federal government has the power to legislate or deal or enter into treaties with Native Americans. Individual states do not have that power. And when John Marshall, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, made his decision, Andrew Jackson did not make a commitment to enforce it. Now, there's an anecdote that Jackson said that whenever John Marshall gave his decision, that he said that John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. What Jackson actually said was probably much worse. He wrote to his friend, John Coffey, and he says that the Chief Justice decision has fallen stillborn, basically saying that it is dead on arrival, that there is nothing that he can or will do in order to enforce it. Congress in 1830 passes the Indian Removal Act. So this is attempting to exchange the land in the Southeast with Native Americans for land west of the Mississippi in Oklahoma Territory. The tribes in question here are the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. Now, some of them will take the deal early on and suffer the least amount of casualties in trying to move across the southeast of the United States, across the Mississippi, and others will wait longer and be forcibly removed, like the Cherokee. The Choctaw are an example of a tribe that left earlier. So between 1831 and 1842, all of these tribes were being moved forcibly one way or another, and about 60,000 total moved, and on the way about 15,000 died, which is why these years and these movements are called the Trail of Tears. All right, so here's the recap. Voting rights expanded for adult white men nationwide. More people participate in politics. We have a new two-party system now between the Whigs and the Democrats. And Jackson's presidency includes issues over tariffs, the Bank of the United States, and Indian removal. And finally, the Trail of Tears was due to coerced removal of southeastern tribes across the Mississippi. Thank you for watching. Next lecture, we're going to go over a new American culture again here in period 4, and also talk about the Second Great Awakening. So I will see you on the next lecture. Thank you for watching.